Stuff I Learned Yesterday, episode 668. Disorganized Progress. Welcome to Stuff I Learned Yesterday. My name is Daryl Darnell. A 2015 PR Newswire survey found that 54% of Americans are overwhelmed by clutter, with 78% feeling unsure of how to deal with it. And I believe that if you aren't learning, you aren't living. Well, who do you think of as a highly organized person? Perhaps you're like me and you think of a TV or movie character like Monica Geller or Claire Dunphy. You know who doesn't come to mind? Me. For today's story, let's jump into the time machine and go back to the early days of my career at the bookstore. In those days, I saw myself as a buyer working from the corporate office rather than continuing up the ladder to become a store manager or regional manager. More specifically, I wanted to be the Bible and software buyer. I knew those products extremely well, and I was passionate about each of them. Now, one day, I got the call I'd been hoping for. Charles, the head buyer for the Books and Bibles department, told me that he'd like to interview me for the Bibles and software buyer position, and of course, I was ecstatic. The interview went pretty well, and it ultimately came down to me and another guy named Dylan, and in the end, Dylan was offered the position. Now, I was extremely disappointed, but I knew Dylan well, and I didn't mind losing to him if I had to be honest. He was extremely smart and analytical. He also knew the products well, and I knew that Charles had made a great choice. Buyer positions didn't open up very often, and so I knew my chances of getting another shot were very small. So a couple of years later, I opted to become a store manager instead. And that turned out to be a good choice. I performed well, I took the store from being a low performer to a high performer, and I won bonuses for doing it. My work was noticed by the corporate office, and after 2 years, my phone rang again. And it was Charles again. This time, it was different. He wasn't hiring for the Bible and software position. Dylan was still doing a great job there. Instead, he was adding a new buyer responsible for buying nearly all of the books we stocked. Charles would remain the buyer for bargain books, but the remaining categories would be handled by this new hire. So just as before, Charles and I sat down for an interview. And at one point, he asked me about my weaknesses. And after some thought, I shared that I struggled with organization. I didn't struggle with keeping the store organized. From an inventory control and personnel management perspective, the store was very well organized. But my office was a mess, and I struggled to manage paperwork. Well, days and weeks went by with no word from Charles. But eventually, I got the call, and Charles let me know that he had decided to hire me for the position. And of course, I could not have been more excited. The new job was more difficult than I expected. The team consisted of Charles, Dylan, Teresa, our secretary, and Susan, an assistant buyer who worked directly for me. And she was great. It took us a few weeks to get into a groove, but she helped me get acclimated much more quickly than I'd otherwise have been able to do. However, just as we began to get settled, Susan let us know that she and her husband were expecting, and we were all very excited for them. A few months later, Susan left for maternity leave, planning to return once her leave concluded. Charles opted not to hire anyone to replace her, even temporarily. So there I was, barely settled into this new job, now doing the job of two people. I was responsible for buying more products than any other buyer in the company, and it was overwhelming. I started struggling right away due to the sheer volume of products and my lack of organizational skills. Charles saw my struggles, and we had a few candid conversations. Now, I could have blamed the situation that had me doing two roles, but I couldn't in good faith use that as the primary excuse while knowing my organizational skills were the root cause. It was a very difficult time, and I couldn't wait for Susan to return. In the meantime, I read books about organization, I spoke with Dylan and other buyers about their systems, but I still struggled. Yet, even as I struggled and Charles expressed concerns, he continued giving me more responsibilities. I remember telling Dylan how frustrated I was that Charles kept giving me more work. Exasperated, I told Dylan that either I wasn't performing as poorly as Charles indicated, or Charles was setting me up for failure. Well, when Susan's return date came, she let us know that she had decided to stay home with the baby and would not be returning. Now, I was happy for her decision, but I wish that she had made it months earlier so I could have hired some help. So Charles and I met, and I got approval to begin looking for a new assistant. And after months of searching and interviewing, I finally made a decision and set up a meeting with Charles for his final approval. But as I sat down in his office, he spoke up with an update. He had decided that rather than hire another assistant buyer, the position would become a full buyer. And as such, I would not be hiring for the position, he would. And so the job search was starting over again, and I would be enduring the overwhelm longer. Well, during this time, things went from bad to worse. Advent was an important season, and it was my responsibility to choose which books we would carry, how many to send to each store, and submit that to the secretary for entry into the system. And then I would submit the final order. And I did everything except submit the final order. The paperwork had gotten misplaced on my desk, and I didn't realize it until it was too late. By the time the stores would get the books, it would be too late to sell them. So I spoke with Dylan about options, and he agreed it was too late. And so I decided not to tell Charles, and I hoped that he wouldn't find out. So just as my search had taken months, so did Charles's search. I was relieved when he told me that he had made a decision and the new hire would be starting soon. He told me which categories I would be responsible for, and much to my surprise, it wasn't the categories I was most passionate about or knowledgeable of. Well, 2 weeks later, I understood why. He'd also hired a second buyer, and that buyer would be taking my job. He did know about the Advent books, and it was the last straw in a series of errors due to my lack of organization. Graciously, the company kept me and reassigned me to the stores where I had excelled. 6 months later, after conversations with the people at the corporate office, I decided to go back to school and finish my degree. Challenged to seek a degree in any field I was passionate about, I chose computer programming. I also spoke with our IT director, Joe, and I wanted to know the chances of him hiring me once I graduated. Joe and I had known each other for years. He couldn't make promises, but he said he expected to be growing his department, and the odds were good that he would have a spot for me about the time that I graduated. So we agreed to keep in touch and to continue the conversation as I progressed through my degree program. And so every few months, I called him with updates on what I was learning and my performance. And he was enthusiastic and supportive. I already had several credit hours when I started, and I took CLEP tests to expedite the process more. In all, it took me about 15 months to complete my degree. But at some point, my conversations with Joe changed. He was less enthusiastic, and he even seemed rushed to get me off the phone. Even though I graduated magna cum laude, Joe did not have a spot for me. I felt like something had changed, and I was disappointed that I had seemingly reached a dead end. I eventually discovered that Joe's demeanor changed after a conversation with Charles. When Joe was seriously considering adding me to his team, he did his due diligence, and he spoke with my previous boss about my work history. And naturally, Charles told him about my organization issues. And so based on that conversation, Joe decided he would not be hiring me. Here's what I learned. There are a few lessons we can pull from this story. First, I don't think Charles did anything wrong in his conversation with Joe. He didn't say anything unfair or inaccurate. I also don't think Joe did anything wrong by talking to Charles. In fact, it would have been wrong if he had not spoken with him. But that's where the first lesson comes in. For those in hiring positions, I urge you to go one step further than what Joe did. It would have been nothing for Joe to call me and talk about the situation with Charles, exploring if or how I'd learned and grown from that situation. And then Joe would have had both sides and have had a fuller understanding of how I had developed since working with Charles. And that leads to the next lesson. Were the cards stacked against me in that buyer job? Well, in some ways, yes, but blaming those things rather than looking internally would not only have been passing blame and failing to take responsibility, but it would have prevented me from assessing my own skills and seeking ways to improve them. If I ever wanted to grow or handle higher detailed jobs, I needed to improve myself. And that's exactly what I did. I owned my shortcomings and worked on bettering myself. I now run my own company, and that is highly organized and built on clear and redundant systems. I'm better today because of that failure, and that should be the outcome of any failure we face in life. And lastly, we need to keep our head up and understand that missed opportunities are not the end of the world. When Joe passed on hiring me, it felt like a dead end. But if he had hired me, I would have been his subordinate with 5 or 6 other people ahead of me in the pecking order. Instead, a few months later, Jason hired me to start the e-commerce department. That job placed me equal with Joe. Had Joe hired me, I wouldn't have been available for the better job offer coming my way. Now, does it always happen that way? Of course not. But in all things, we should seek and trust in God. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. I'm Daryl Darnell, and this has been Stuff I Learned Yesterday. Well, I want you to be a part of the next Monday Mailbag on December 29th. Monday Mailbag is your opportunity to share what you've learned so that other listeners and I can learn from you. It can be a short message, as short as 30 seconds, or it can be several minutes long. It really doesn't matter, just as long as it's something that will benefit others. You can send in questions or responses to my SILY episodes, and I'll respond to them via Monday Mailbag episodes. You can participate in Monday Mailbags by visiting the Golden Spiral Media listener feedback page at goldenspiralmedia.com/feedback, or shoot me an email at feedback@goldenspiralmedia.com.